Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Welcome to the Reasonably Fine Art Talk. I am over the moon today because one of my absolute favorite artists ever has agreed to be our guest today. And I know a bunch of people are excited about this as well. Dean Mitchell, it is a joy and an honor to have you with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure, Charlie. I'm a fan of yours too, so that goes both ways. I mean,
You're
I love your
crazy.
work.
You're insane. I look at my stuff, it looks like a horrible injured animal pulling itself across the finish line. Your stuff sings with grace and beauty. You're
Oh, I don't
great.
know, Charlie. I think we're in the same boat, quite
How
frankly.
did you what is the story of Dean Mitchell? You were one of the Hallmark artists, right?
Yeah. I got recruited there in 1980. I didn't stay very long. I got let go very quickly, which has probably worked out to be the best thing for me because I really didn't like illustration. I don't like people telling me what to do, and I had a very hard time in illustration. It just didn't fit my personality very well.
Uh-huh. And,
So
and and so from that, did you immediately go into doing fine art full time?
no, Charlie. Actually, I have been doing fine art even somewhat as a teenager. I had a junior high school teacher that got us interested in competing against other high school students and stuff like that. And so I've always been interested in that aspect of it. But heard from my mother, who was my grandmother's first person to get an education, college education. It was just hard to make a living. And so, but I really fell in love with the process. And really, I had my first gallery show when I was probably 19 years old in Panama City, Florida. And I had already been selling my work. I was selling my work to help me get through college, actually.
Really?
So yeah, so I've had a lot of gallery experience way before I got to Hallmark. I'd already entered national competitions that I'd entered and won, and so by the time I was 27, I was a member of the American Watercolor Society. But so I've been, so I actually have always wanted to be a fine artist. I never wanted to be an illustrator, but I heard it, was hard, so I majored in illustration, minor in advertising, which
Uh,
which came in handy later on when I published my own book. So some of those skills they kind of cross over, and if you know a lot about the history of art, a lot of artists, even like Leonardo da Vinci, these people they experimented with designing different things and objects and different things. So I think art just kind of falls. This whole thing about illustration is it's all just kind of
I know it's in about 200 years, these particular discussions are going to look insane.
yeah, they are. It's kind of like whatever. Art is art. It is what it is.
Exactly. And with that, why don't we go into starting looking at the slides?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh,
It's funny. I had a presentation already put together with a museum, and I had my wife to pull some things, and I think I'm mostly showing watercolors now. I work in a lot of mediums. If people have gone to my website, I work in oils, watercolor, acrylic, different things. And this is a watercolor. This is actually my mother's one of my mother's professors at Florida A&M. She is probably close. She's probably in her 90s here. She lived to be, I think, about 100. And she taught my mother. But and usually with watercolors, I usually work a lot from drawings. If there's any research involved, I usually do sketches. Sometimes people say it, but a lot of times I do sketches and I work from the sketch, and then I kind of apply my own color and sensibility to it. But
so
I'm very. Go ahead.
no, so the source material from this was life sitting doing a sketch and then construct doing the
And then
water.
constructing. Yeah, I've been constructing because a lot of times people go out to do plein air. I've done plein air mostly watercolors, but I prefer drawings a lot. And I've been out there with watercolors and gotten eaten a lot with bugs. With watercolors trying to do paintings and stuff like that. But a lot of times I like a sketch because with watercolor, I don't put a lot of drawing down. There's some artists who put a lot of drawing down. I tend to do what I call more of a gesture drawing. And then most of the structure itself is done with the paint. And if you kind of zoom in on my work, you'll see there's not a whole lot of pencil in it because most of it is done with a brush. I kind of tend to like the freedom of it and the unpredictability of it. Now, I mess up an awful lot of watercolors. I want people to understand that. I mess up an awful lot of watercolors. And and I don't throw away the paper. What I do is I gesso over the paper and I reuse it for drawing or something else. So I recycle it. So I know the historians will have fun with Dean Mitchell when they start seeing if they X-ray some of these paintings, they're going to see all kind of crap underneath.
They're going to love that. They're going to love that. Yeah.
So absolutely. I don't really have a formula for watercolor. I kind of learned. I took a watercolor class, but I really learned how to use watercolor by reading a book and then just experimenting and not being intimidated by the paint. Because if you hear anybody talk about watercolor, it is a master's medium and it is unforgivable in certain ways. But that's what I like about it.
That Sargent, one of my favorite quotes, and maybe all watercolorists know it, but since I'm not primarily a watercolorist, when I first heard it, I thought it was great. So Sargent said, painting in watercolor is like painting in the middle of an ongoing emergency.
Yeah, that's a good analysis. It's interesting. Yeah.
One of the things that, to me, that utterly blows me away about your work is your compositional sense and your joy in the light-dark dichotomy. Like in this, the way you have that light behind her shoulder, just so slotted in there between the chair and her face. Mm-hmm. That to me, and then have the curve of the eyeglass. That is such a beautiful ballad. That moment, I think, is just extraordinary. And because there's a softness in much of the rest of it.
Yeah, there is. There are certain places where I may make it slightly sharper. And because what I like is I like the push and pull of a space. Mm-hmm. I'm constantly aware of something dropping back and pulling forward. It's sort of a push and pull thing. And even with the figure, with the face, it's the same thing. There's soft edges, and then there's some things that are a little bit more crisper than others. So your eye kind of flows in and out of the space. Because when you're painting, and it's funny, I used to do a lot of things early on as a kid that had extreme hard edges. And my teacher said I saw abstractly. I see negative space. I see squares and rectangles in everything I do. Very little detail. Detail's like the last thing for me. And really, my work is not that detailed. Some people think my work is detailed, and it's not. It has to. I have the illusion. I have the way of accenting certain things, and then your eye kind of fills in the rest. Exactly. It looks like there's more there than what it really is. And when people get up on the work, they'll say, "God, there's really nothing there." I said, "Yeah, because I'm backing away from it. I'm going up on it, and I'm backing away. It's a back and forth thing."
Do you do that? There's another quote. One of my favorite quotes or things I heard about Sargent was that he had Oriental rugs on the floor of his studio, and they said it was so worn between his easel and where he would stand to look at paintings that it looked like a cow path had been worn in the rug.
Yeah, I believe that, because even though I work in watercolor, I'll start up at an easel with it, Charlie. And then, but before it's over, it's on the floor. It's totally on the floor, and I'm standing over top of it. And the brush sometimes is so loaded with paint that it's starting to drip. It's starting to drip, and I kind of like that. I like that freedom. And so, you can keep it fresh. So what people understand with watercolor, you really need to keep the brush really saturated with water, unless you're doing, something like what Wyatt does with a dry brush type thing. Right. I keep the brush is usually very saturated with water because I want the paint to really kind of glide across the surface. And then there's some paintings that have a lot of what I call superimposed washes. Then I have to wait until the wash is dry. And this is why sometimes I tell people, sometimes I'm working on 5 to 10 works. Because while one's drying, I'm doing something else. And so there's this constant interplay sometimes between the figure and a structure. So there's a constant interplay back and forth, because sometimes I run into problems with something with a structure, and then the figure gives me an idea, and I go back to the structure. So it's kind of a back and forth playing for me.
Right, you do a lot of figures, and you do a lot of structures. You don't do a lot of figures in structures, but
No, I've done very few. Now it's I'm sort of looking at the urban landscape a little bit more. I was looking at the urban landscape a little bit more when I was in Kansas City, when I lived in the inner city, and I started doing figures within the the urban setting. The kind of sport I started liking quite a bit. I'm going back to that, but I'm doing it in a way where I'm using acrylics now, where it's a little bit more minimalist. There's not a lot of detail. The same thing with what I do with watercolor, except it's acrylic. I'm sort of flattening things and accenting things with certain kinds of highlights and then certain kinds of contrasts. So there's a constant back and forth that with acrylics too, the same way.
Right.
It's very intuitive. It's not a.
We're going to get into that when we get to the acrylics, because acrylics terrify me. But now, Bill Daniel asks, light details, the white of the paper, gouache, or other?
White of the paper. And I don't use liquid Triscuit. There are people who use this liquid stuff. I hate it.
That's illegal.
I can't. Some people do. Some people know how to use it. I'm too spontaneous. It would drive me crazy to have to pull. If I can't. Sometimes what happens is when I'm doing a dark space and it's really dark and I want it to be light, I either paint around it, or when it's really wet, I blot it real quickly. Because sometimes it depends on how saturated the paper is. It'll bleed back into the white, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes I'll hit it with a dryer to dry it quickly, and I hit it again, and I can pull it up almost to the white on the paper, and you get a nice soft edge that way.
All right, we're going to move on to the second one here. Is this also watercolor, or
yeah, this is watercolor. Now, a lot of this has a lot of negative space. It's a lot of this is the white of the paper. Part of her sneakers and part of the background there. And then sometimes when there's a lot of subtlety, there's a lot of subtleties within a white structure. And so sometimes I work off of a large meat tray, and sometimes I have to be very careful with whether the gray is warm enough or cool enough to give that sense of light and structure, and then sort of accenting certain things about it. Certain things I kind of lose and find. Yeah.
Is there any color shift in watercolor, or is it pretty true? It's more of a value shift as
it is. It's more of a value shift, and like some of the darker areas, I may drop in. I wet it first, and then I'll put in my darkest dark. Sometimes people they say you got to work from light to dark. Not really. That's a traditional way of working. Sometimes I've done watercolors where I start off with the darkest dark, and then I kind of build around it. But it's really about how wet the paper is, what you're trying to do with one color flowing into another color. And sometimes it's just one big shape. You just wet it and you just push it into one big shape. And then once it's dry and slightly dry, then you can kind of accent it here or there with your darks. While it's still slightly damp, because if you leave it slightly damp, you're going to maintain that freshness.
Yeah, which is so hard to do. During the pandemic, I took a online watercolor workshop with Andy Evenson out of Minnesota.
Oh, yeah, he's great. He's good.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
I learned it's hard.
Yeah,
watercolor's hard.
No, watercolor is yeah. I'm doing some bigger paintings now, like 38 by 48, really big watercolors now. And when I first started trying this, I thought, oh my God, this is intimidating, but because watercolor is just, and I found myself actually enjoying it. I had to really walk around the thing. I worked on it up the easel, but I thought, God, this is not gonna work up on the easel. I gotta walk around this thing, and then and sometimes I have to straddle it, put my legs across the middle and just kind of drop the paint. And I'm straddling, hoping I don't fall in it and destroy the whole thing. It was offering different challenges for me as a painter.
Wow, that's amazing. I can't even fathom that. So
yeah, it was fun. I thought I wouldn't enjoy it. I said, God, this is so big. I don't know if I'll enjoy this, and I actually loved it. It actually made me a lot looser and a lot even more freer with the paint. And I, as I was dropping, I felt like Jackson Pollock or something, trimming the paint stuff and splattering it and stuff, and then say, okay, I'm gonna make this area a tree, and I drop the paint and I splatter it. And I'm brutal on brushes. I have to buy a lot of brushes when I'm using watercolor because I'll slam the brush to get a certain kind of energy or effect in the thing. So I'm brutal on brushes. Even for watercolor, I'm brutal. I have to buy a lot of brushes. I'm just brutal.
Well, you got to crack some eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah, I mean, it's, because sometimes when I'm in the middle of the thing, I go, oh, it's not dark enough. It's got to go deep. It's got to go, I got to really make it go deep, And it's sometimes it's scary because you're not sure if you go too deep, it's gonna look like mud, and you got to make sure if you're using blue with a reddish color that the temperature is right, so that the color still, even though it's dark, it has a richness to it, as opposed to just using like a sepia, sepia.
Hey.
To get a deep darker watercolor, I use like a blue and some kind of reddish color I use. I don't even know the name of it now. Can't think of the name of it, but to get that deep dark, but it still has a richness to it that doesn't look dull. It has a freshness of the deep.
Right, and so okay, so that is a combination of two pigments intermixed.
Yeah.
Is it an ultramarine blue and like a burnt sienna or something, or
not a burnt sienna? I use burnt sienna sometimes if I'm doing a gray. I'll use those combinations, very similar to what oil painters use. But there's some kind of a rose. Is it a madder? It's some kind of brown madder. It's some kind of, I think it's a brown madder that I use. But sometimes I don't really mix it. I may hit it with the blue, and the blue is really bright, so I hit it with the brown on top of it. It's still wet, so it's still deep, and it has a spontaneity to it. It's kind of fresh and lush, It's deep and lush. Yeah.
It has a deeper depth than if it was just that one pigment.
Because you look at some of my, like even like this painting Bob Ragland. There's if you look at this his eyeglass place there, something he's holding this thing and it's like it's cooler, and then below it gets a little bit warmer. Whether that's really correct or not, I don't really care about correctness when I'm painting. I don't even know what that is exactly. I paint where it's it feels right to me or it doesn't.
Right.
I don't have a formula. It's like, okay, I need something over here. What do I do? And then I'll throw a shape where there isn't a shape at. It's like, I need a shape over here. It needs to be hard edge, or it needs to be sort of organic and free flowing.
Right. Well, I mean, what my metaphor for that is that we're storytellers.
Yeah.
And story truth is different from literal truth. Something is more truthful, though it may not be exactly factually correct. Right. It has the verisimilitude. Yeah. Now, a couple of things I wanted to talk about on this is your mastery of grays. Mm-hmm. And everyone watching, just throughout this slideshow, look at how you honor the paint. You honor the variation of warm and cool and hue. I mean, it's so respectful of your medium to pay attention to that, because people will, just slop color on there without really thinking about what it's doing. This is a symphony of grays with a little bits of those reddish. I mean, you've got the red in the eye, you've got the red at the side of his elbow, you've got the red in the glasses case, and the red in the shadows. But it's just stunning. It's stunning work.
You know what, Charlie? I tell you, I had a class in college with the president of the school, CCAD. His name was Dean Kanzani, and the first semester we worked in black and white. That was it, just black and white. And I'm like, we just doing black and white. What is this black and white stuff? So I had to learn all the value scale with just black and white. And then we did black and white plus one color, black and white plus two color, then a triad type thing. But one of the things that I picked up from that particular class was he was always talking about the grays. He said, the secret to painting is the subtleties and in between tonalities of grays. He was always preaching the grays. The secret is in the grays. The secret is in the grays, you know. And I thought, the secret's in the grays, you know. But he was right. The secret is in the grays. It is. Those subtle nuances, those lyrical, those are the kind of things that, you know, it's kind of like a symphony. You know, when you hear classical music, you hear the violins and you hear the drums and you hear the all these different instruments. It's the same thing with painting. Painting is kind of there's a musical form to it, no different than there is here. And I listen to a lot of classical music, but what I'm saying is there's something about the rhythm of something, the use of line. Because if you look at Bob Regan, there are some straight linear lines in the foreground of his dance there. There's some linear forms there that I just kind of thought, maybe kind of fun to put in some lines here. This is just to give it a little bit of interesting texture. You know, what just straight lines. You know, did it exist in real life? Not really. It's the artist has to use his imagination whenever you're doing something.
Right, and you have to. The telling thing that you said earlier is you draw.
I draw a lot.
A lot.
You know, an awful lot. Drawing, and I can tell you right now, for watercolor, for me, you know, I remember my first drawing class, life drawing class at CCAD, and the professor walked around to see where everybody was in terms of drawing. And of course, you know, like most people, you start off drawing the head, and you draw you start adding on. That's how I drew when I was, you know, high school. I just kind of, you know, my teacher was out to my gesture drawing. He would do these little scribble stuff. I'm like, Miss Harris, that looks like nothing. All these scribbles. Well, come to find out, you know, those scribbles, he was right. You know, but what happened was, you know, the professor sat down. He told everybody to stop, and he sat down. He made the model move every 5 seconds, move, and he was just going through. He's going to go through a lot of paper here, and I'm like, he's just scribbling. I'm like, what is this? He's just flipping and scribbling, and then he said, slow down. 30 seconds, then a minute. I think within 2 minutes, he had the whole entire essence of the figure. And I was like, oh my God, I want to learn how to do that. I want to learn how to do that. And that has been my biggest understanding, even for using watercolor, because it is a gestural quality to it, just like drawing. You know, I use my whole arm when I'm painting. You know, even with watercolor, I'm using my whole arm. So that, you know, those gesture drawings is a part of that process. And so I learn a lot from drawing. Drawing is, I cannot emphasize drawing enough. And you don't always have to try to make it look so detailed. Just try to capture the essence of the thing. This way you learn how to see quickly. This is what gesture drawing taught me, how to see quickly, more immediately, as opposed to, you know, the long poses for me tend to kind of bore me. They kind of bored me too. I don't know what it was, but I tend to like things that are done quickly, not labored over.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like the divine is kind of with us early on, you know, being flowery about it, but there's a freshness, there's a wildness, there's a divinity.
There is.
When you work it too long, our little brains take over, and our little brains are stiff and constricting things, and you lose that freshness.
Yeah, you can kill a thing. I mean, I know I've killed a lot of things too, thinking I can save it, and I'm overworking. It's not working. You know, it's not working.
This is another masterful study, and was this done at all contemporaneously with the previous one?
Yes, you can see they were done around the same time. You look at the color, even the color scheme, and the way I'm chiseling. Now, you know, Bob had a studio with a lot of stuff, you know, and you know, it's impossible to get, you know, to sit there and render the form. So if you look at this part, it's a very abstract thing, but you know it. There's a desk there. You can kind of tell, but it's really an abstraction. You know, it's just really abstraction. I have no idea. Sometimes when I'm doing something like that, I have no idea whether I can pull it off or not, or whether it work. I go, oh, I got to put a shape over here, even if it's not there. I want to make this feel like there's something there. So I start chiseling it. It's kind of like a sculptor. You start chiseling and pushing and pulling something, and that's what that whole space does. It's a lyrical push and pulling of things, but you can't tell exactly what
you're talking about. The shape to the left of his belly, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
And what you do this, that device again at the top of his chest, of the whitest white against a thin dark.
Yeah.
And then that pulls us down into that whole wonderful jumble of abstract shape.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly looking how you move around the space. And one of the things that I was teaching a drawing class, and when I first got let go at Hallmark, I was teaching a drawing class, and some of the kids were having problems with proportions. And I said, well, you're too busy looking at the figure. I said, what do you mean? I said, you're too busy looking at the figure. It's when you're drawing, if you're trying to get accuracy, then you have to look. First of all, you got to consider the frame of reference, and so then it becomes a game of measuring. So you look at that negative space between the arms and the back of the shoulder or whatever, and you look at the legs, and you compare the size relationships of the shapes. So when you're painting, you're constantly it's a constant relationship thing that you're after. It's all about relationships in painting. It's all about relationships and learning how to see those relationships, and not just always looking at what you're trying to capture, but also what's around the object. Particularly if you're trying to compose it and put it in the space and sit it in a space. Because sometimes when I would draw, what I do is I would just draw lines, a couple of lines where I want it to stop and where I want to compose the thing. And then other times I'm just doing something where it's just a little scribble, a little study or something. Then I'm not concerned. But if I'm trying to really compose it, then I'm going to put a slight, gestural square sometimes around it, or a rectangle or whatever it is, however I'm trying to handle the space.
Yeah, that was my training as an undergraduate at college. Was William Bailey, our teacher, always had us draw a border before working on the drawing, because he said you gotta, you're composing, and if you
compose, that's right,
could go off.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, granted, I have done some paintings where I've just exploded. I just want to explode. And what happened was sometimes I would only use a fourth of an entire sheet of watercolor paper. I go, it's not working. And so I'll get different size mats, and I'll start moving it around to find an interesting composition. I have worked on paintings where I've worked on a long time. It's just not working. And I'd either cut them in half, sliced them in quarters or whatever, because it just weren't working. So I try not to lose my time, but sometimes it's impossible to regain it. And then other times you got to go, oh, this is beautiful, but I got to crop, 70% of it off or 60% of it out. It's not going to work. I've done.
We've got to be kind of brutal to our pieces at times.
Yeah, you have to really look at what you're doing. So particularly if you're, I'm very sensitive to shapes, and if I look at something, I go, it's a great painting, but what are you doing with the space, and how's this really working in terms of relationships? When I'm looking at something, it's just something. When I look at something, I see the abstraction right away. I pick up on that right away.
Is that something you feel you've always had, or is that something that got honed over years of drawing?
Well, according to my junior high school teacher, he said I saw abstractly.
Right.
He said you see abstractly, but you suffer technically. Because he said your technique is really sloppy. You're not really good technically. And so he drilled that in me. And so when I got to college, I became obsessed with technique. He said, you have an amazing eye for composition, but your ability to handle paint is not very good. Your technique isn't good. And so I became obsessed when I got in college with learning how to paint. Learning about the materials became an obsession for me.
Interesting. And at that time, were you primarily working in watercolor, or were you working across a spectrum?
I was working across the board. I was working in oils and a lot of pen and ink. Actually, I used to draw with a fountain pen. Ink.
Really?
Yeah. We used to go outside and draw with a blue ballpoint pen. And I remember turning one in for an assignment. The teacher hated it. He said, "What's this ballpoint pen blue?" So I had to lose the ballpoint pen. So
anything works by whatever.
yeah, it was, I guess it was a way, when we went outside, we didn't have to worry about things smearing. If we had a lot of times when you're drawing, you had your hands all over stuff and it's smearing everywhere.
Yeah.
So with the pen, it's a little bit different.
And I've seen beautiful work with ballpoint pen. It's
oh yeah. My junior high school teacher did great drawings with pen, and we would go outside and we would draw a lot of the old barns and a lot of the old houses in the area, dilapidated houses, and some of the houses people were living in, but some of them they weren't. And so I think that's how I ended up falling in love with structures too. I mean, did a lot of it when we were kids. Did a lot of it. So
right. Well, now this one is very different. This is really abstracted. This reminds me of like 1920s kind of composition. What's the story on this? And is this acrylic or?
It's an oil.
It's an oil. Okay.
It's an oil. Basically for me, it's about negative space and movement. And you look at the chair. I mean, it's sort of a chair, but not really.
Right.
Yeah. And then you got the same kind of diagonal with the bow she's playing with it. And so there's this interesting movement. Then there's this negative space between her arm and her hair, and then there's this negative space between her lips and her hair. And I'm really looking at how the negative space around her. There's a lot of triangles and rectangles and stuff in this thing.
Yeah, and
it does interesting things with negative space.
Yeah, and you use that device. There's another painting we're going to be looking at where you use the device with the bow again to lead us off the page. And that beautiful thin line. But the once again, this is all grays.
It's all grays.
And with just the skin tone being really the only thing that really makes it color.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the violin as well.
Yeah, but it's mostly. But you're right. It's mostly grays. It is. It's dominantly grays.
And
there's a lot of contrast.
What size would this one be?
I think it's 18 by 24.
And now you start to kill me and make me feel unworthy as a human being because you're getting into my bailiwick of landscape.
This is really an acrylic too. This is I start fooling around with the acrylics, and doing the landscape in the West, and so again, but there's a lot of grays in this.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly a lot of grays.
It's you can trace a line back to Whistler with a symphony of grays, but then you've got those sharp, you've got your huge block of sky color and then the shards that constitute the light hitting the building.
Yeah,
draw us down there. But this is you're really abstracting the landscape. I mean, this is
absolutely. It's all triangles and rectangles.
Yeah,
that's all it is.
And do you recollect what was the mental path that led you to say no curves in this one?
You know what? It was a matter of it again. Like I said, I'm an intuitive painter. And so if you look at how well the mountain marries the structure itself, there's a lot of repetition within the structure itself. They're similar shapes. Even if you look at some of the mountains, it almost looks like they could be houses. If you really look at them, they're kind of repeating that shape, that's up front, really.
Yeah, really, they are. You're right.
Yeah, and so there's this interesting interplay there. But what I've done is I've graded them so they fall back slightly, but you still feel like the light's hitting it. And up front here, I pushed it a little bit warmer with some warmer color. Mm-hmm. There's some deeper oranges in there that don't pick up in this one, but it gets really warm where the cool kind of drops back, and that really kind of sails you forward.
Now, when you're working in acrylic, is it primarily opaque acrylic, or is there some transparency in there?
There is a combination. Sometimes with the acrylics, I like to have a little bit of the feel of underpainting coming through. And this one, I know for sure, this is on a Crescent watercolor board.
Oh, really?
There is a watercolor under here that did not work out. It's under there. And what I do is I'll take gesso and I'll mix sometimes a little bit of cream color with it. I mean, like a ochre, and sometimes a little bit of black, sometimes, depending on how cool I want to go with it. And I'll use a fan brush and I'll just paint over it a couple of times, because the watercolor will bleed through a little bit sometimes. I'll put a couple of coats down and I'll let that swirly brushstroke come through, because then that serves as a nice kind of textural quality to it, to let some of that underpainting of the acrylic come through. That keeps it very rich.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then sometimes I've done acrylics where I use sort of this stuff that you put in it to keep it slightly wet. Now they have acrylics that stay longer. They stay wet longer. I think they have a whole another line that stays wet longer. But before they had the stuff that you put a couple of drops in it and it stays really wet. Now, I have done some portraits where they look like oil paintings, but it's acrylic. And it's the same, very direct. It's some of that chiseling. And then I'll let it dry. I'll start off deep, and then I'll pull the lights up. And then sometimes I'll let the underpainting come through by just touching a little bit and pulling it up. And then you still have that nice rich color to it, where sometimes if you mix it too much, then it starts to looking kind of dull. It kind of loses that rich quality that you want with acrylic. It's a very funny medium too. It's a very funny medium.
It's a really tricky medium. I mean,
yeah, it's a really funky medium, although I like it.
I've been playing with it a bit recently, and you know, I really respect it, but it's tricky. It's not easy to know.
Yeah.
Now, is this acrylic as well?
No, this is a watercolor. This is using Fabriano paper. Okay. I think the other watercolors were all on Crescent watercolor board. This is on Fabriano paper. I don't know if you know Pierre, who he represents he's Fabriano guy, and he's become a friend. And he brought this paper over to the studio, and I had a drawing up of the side of a barn, and I ended up doing a little demo. I wasn't intended to do a demo for him, but I wanted to test the paper so bad. I said, "Oh, you want to try this paper?" I said, "Let me," and I stuck it up on the easel, and I stuck my drawing up, and I started off real quick, very direct, gestural, very bold, and I ended up taking it into a finished painting because I liked the paper. I said, "God, this is great paper." I wasn't really always a big fan of watercolor paper, but this paper was really nice. I thought, I think I could work with this stuff. And I've enjoyed working with Fabriano paper. I really like this. I really like that paper.
All right. Well, that's one level of sophistication beyond mine. I'm still learning about how radically different the watercolor papers are.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, there's some papers that really suck the paint in, and then there are other papers like this. You can't think of it's like has a very soft feel to it. And what I liked about it was I could go very deep very quickly without having to really force it. It goes very deep very quickly, and it takes superimposed washes very nice. I like a paper that sucks the paint in but slightly rides the surface.
Okay.
A little bit. Other papers that just suck it in. You got to really work it. I don't like to labor over something. And this paper is just, I really like it. It's perfect for me.
Well, it's a beautiful portrait. And again, everybody look at the grays and how he builds up from the bottom. Look at the shadows that the dress is casting on the plane behind the woman.
And then, what makes this painting interesting is really, aside from her engaging you, it is the way it's composed.
Mm-hmm.
It's the space around her. The space around her, the negative space around her is very lyrical. and very musical. It's very
Yeah,
musical.
it is very.
The way she's placed off-centered, and the way the violin is slightly tilted slightly away from her. And then the bow there is tilted downward slightly. And then the chair, it kind of angles slightly too, just slightly enough to balance that angle. So you got an interesting rhythm of angles. And then you have this like this staircase effect of her dress.
Exactly.
It does interesting things. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I just have to keep saying it's beautiful.
Thank you. This is also on Fabriano. This is a painting of my mother when she was dealing with dementia. I painted quite a few paintings of my mother, and some are not quite showing her in this kind of state. But my mother was always asking me to paint her. And I told her, I said, the best way, Mama, I said, Mama, you don't ask me to paint you, because if you ask me to paint you, chances are I won't. Don't ask me to paint you. So she stopped. And I wasn't raised by my mother. I was raised by my grandmother. And I became very close to my mom. So I wanted to paint her, but I also saw, I saw her life, sort of coming to an end. And it was a very... And I've always been fascinated with that, because I had a great grandmother. My grandma Silly died when I was probably about 5 or 6. So I've always been fascinated with life and the human body and time, and how it invades everything that's around us, including structures and and our own lives. So I just trying to capture that part of her. I have this painting hanging in my home, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Along with several others that I've done of her. There are other ones that I've done of her where it's totally abstracted. I used acrylic where all you see is a silhouette of her. You don't even, you just see the structure of the head, and then there's a couple of colors in it, but it's mostly almost black and white with a few subtle grays in it, but very abstract, very flat shapes, just totally flat, black almost, just flat. No detail at all.
Okay, there are a couple of technical questions that came in.
Yeah.
So no, not that one. This question: hot press Fabriano or cold press Fabriano?
I believe it's a soft press.
Soft press. Okay.
Soft press. Yeah, it's a soft press Fabriano.
And do you mostly work upright on an easel when painting watercolors? Do you work?
You know what? It's both. I usually, first of all, when I was a kid, I couldn't afford an easel, so I was used to sitting on the floor, kind of folding my legs. I still do that. Start off, and it ends up on the floor, leaning against something. I have a bad habit of that still. I get up at an easel, but I can't stay there. And sometimes when I'm drawing it, I'm at an easel because I'm sketching, so I'm at an easel. But by the time when I want to get really free with it and really get the structure down immediately, it's on the floor. And then when I want to do something more subtle and I'm backing back and forth, I'm sitting down, I'm painting a little bit, then I'm getting up. It's a back and forth. Sometimes I'm standing, sometimes I'm sitting. Depends on the area that I think. If it's a very, very delicate area, then I'm sitting and I'm looking and examining before I put the stroke down. Because once the stroke is down, it's down. So, and then if I go, I like it, but it's too soft. It needs more strength. And I drop it on the floor, and then I pound it somewhere with dark or something.
You go into your caveman.
Yeah, and I gotta pound it somewhere because it's too soft. It needs a little strength somewhere. So, yeah.
So when you see Mitchell drop the painting on the floor, then
I'm getting ready to pound on it. Yeah.
Once again, before we go to the next painting, what I want to point out to people is just the shapes, the round table on the right, the shape of the back of the chair catching the light, all that stuff so informs, it cuts into the other spaces, and it informs and defines the picture plane, or the planes within the picture plane. And just the subtle behind the chair, the forms behind the chair, I'm not sure what they are, but I believe them. They
Hey, Charlie, I don't either. So, but here's an interesting thing about this painting. If you look, if you cover that white or her blouse area, the painting becomes way too heavy. You lose that. Oh, you need that negative space there. You know, and so I'm constantly. Now, was it that color? No, but you know, I needed that shape there, so I left it white so it could breathe, so it doesn't feel heavy.
Right, and the same with her hand in the foreground bottom right.
Yeah.
If that highlight wasn't there, that would become a really dead.
Yep. You need that light. You need that open. You need that negative space in there. So you have to really be conscious of what you're. Again, it is about composing and composition. You know, and if you look at the background, it's an abstraction. I mean, it's pure abstraction. It's just pure abstraction. That's what it is. So when I look at, this was one of the things that I used to, when I first worked at Hallmark, I had, there were some people who just, they hated, they really didn't like Andy Wyatt's work. You know, that's people who really liked like Robert Motherwell and Franz Klein. And so do I. And so we were all at the bookstore, and I love telling the story. We were all at the bookstore. And I said, so you don't like Andy Wyatt, So I pulled out Wyatt, and I pulled out Franz Klein, and I pulled out Robert Motherwell, and I pulled out Wyatt, and I pulled out one of his paintings. It had a basket scene or something in it, and I said, and I put my hand over it. I said, "There's your Motherwell, and there's your Franz Klein, and there's all of it." And they was like, "Wow, it really is." I said, "Yeah, you don't like his subject matter." But the man's a hell of an abstract designer. He's an abstract painter, so I don't discriminate when I'm looking at a work of art. I love non-objective work. I love work that doesn't have anything recognizable in it. Now, initially, I wasn't always that way, Charlie. I remember seeing some Franz Klein's work, and I was like, what is that? Like, what is that? And the more I painted, the more I began to go, there's a lot more to this, and de Kooning and the way if you look at some of my work, I incorporate some of the line, no different than de Kooning. I use the watercolor, but I'm incorporating some of that line. So I'm constantly looking at different forms of art because that does inform me. So when I go back to the easel, it's not that I'm copying them, it's just that I'm being informed in a different way. And I'm looking at the language of paint. Not necessarily just the language of object and what something looks like, but what the artist is doing with the language of paint. Line, form, texture, movement, space, all of it matters. Look at everything. Don't discriminate just because you don't like it personally. You don't like the subject, whatever it is. I look at something, I try to pull from it, I try to learn from it. Texture. It's all kind of ways of looking at a work of art. Not necessarily that you like the subject.
Absolutely. You're so right. I mean, one of the most powerful works of art I saw was at Mass MoCA, a guy named Zhao Bing, who builds 200-foot long dragons out of found materials.
Oh man!
Asian construction sites, and it's so moving.
Yeah.
It's this huge phoenix, and you're walking underneath it, and it's old, butane lighters and construction barrels and barricades, and it's what has the capacity to move us,
Yeah, absolutely.
And by whatever means necessary. And the other thing I like about, some conceptual art, some stuff. I mean, I would never think of doing it, and I don't have to because someone else is.
Exactly. But you can learn from it. You can learn from it and be inspired by it. Surely. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
And see, this is one of my urban scenes, out of New Orleans. For a long time, I still go to New Orleans a lot, but it's funny because this is actually in Jackson Square. I mean, you would never know it, but because I've eliminated so much stuff. I just it's just a shape behind them and stuff. but the hat, I exaggerated the colors there. So a lot of things again, it's really, again, there is a lot of grays. There's a lot of grays in this too. There's a lot of grays in this.
Yep. And again, just mastery of shape and what you're choosing to do, where you're directing the eye through light, dark, juxtaposition, and you lose some edges in the back shadows, even though it's a pretty hard-edged painting.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, if you look at it kind of close up, you'll see some of it's acrylic. You can see some of the underpainting kind of coming through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of the warmth.
Some of the warmth. Yeah.
Now this kills me.
This was a nightmare to draw out, though. I had to use a lot of T-square with a lot of this stuff. This is in New York, and I was trying to capture a sense of the density, and I think that's what it's called, urban density. The density of all these structures, these windows, it's a lot of energy in this thing. And then this industrial pipe sort of sweeping across it. It's kind of interesting. It's an interesting space.
Yeah.
This started off as a watercolor, and I didn't like it. It wasn't as successful. So I start painting over it with acrylics, and just really start chiseling it a little bit more and making it a little more abstract, a little more simple, actually.
Interesting. You made some really fascinating compositional decisions here, especially to me. What I notice are the three windows on the extreme left. Those little bits of the windows, because that's
over there. Oh yeah.
That's a very conscious decision.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then you sort of reference that by the four windows behind the dominant building, the gray building. You've got a teeny bit of the four windows on that one.
Yeah, you do. There's a repetition going on there. Yeah.
This reminds me of like I see references to Sheeler. I see references to a lot of abstract art as well. And almost De Chirico in some. The color world over there on the right. Just the scale, the way you will have another thing to pay attention to, class. The variety of shapes that you've got, the variety of size of shape that you've got going on there. So good. So
that was, that's funny you talk about that, because that was the other thing. We had a class at a two-dimensional design class where sometimes we had to do something where we had to use squares and move the different size squares on a white piece of paper and make it interesting in terms of negative space and stuff. So, and then a couple of times we had to use line to make something interesting. So I think a lot of that, I think I had a natural ability for design anyway, but I think that actually helped me understand the language itself more by doing those exercises. Even though I think I had an intuitive nature toward abstraction, it helped me understand the language. So when I'm doing something, I know what I'm doing versus I'm just sort of hitting it and missing it because I have an intuitive nature. But now I understand the language.
Yeah. Good point. And a really good exercise. I mean, that's one of the things I find frustrating in teaching or leading a 3 or 4 day workshop is, it took 2 years for something to actually percolate through my brain when I was in college. What do you think I can convey this to anybody in 3 days?
Oh, it's not enough time. I remember I used to teach some watercolor classes too, workshops when I was younger. I did a lot of it because I need the money. I need to earn a living. And people would sign up for it. I think I made the mistake one time when I worked and when I lived in Kansas City. I did a night class. I did a day class and a night class. Well, a night class, a lot of artists from homework came. And by the time the night class came, I was so burnt. I thought, I could do this, But boy, after about a week of that, and then people, who they want to learn how to use watercolor, and it was very, very difficult because with watercolor like I said, I work off of a meat tray, and people are asking me questions while I'm working, and I'm not a verbal person when I'm working, and I would say, look, don't ask me now. I can't talk and paint because I'm like, I can't. Some artists, I admire some artists who can really paint and talk. They can paint and talk. Now I can draw and talk, but painting, I can't paint and talk. Some people can do that. That drives me up the wall. Ask me later.
All right. Now we're back. This is watercolor?
Yeah, this is watercolor too. I don't have hardly any acrylics or oil. I didn't put any oils in. But anyway, this is my cousin Caroline. This is done from a drawing too. And a lot of it is, like if you look at the ear, I mean, I really pushed the red there, Well, maybe I pushed it a little too red, but it was down, so it was it, And then the rest of this stuff is just, I think I put down enough line just to sort of capture the essence of the thing. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of it, you look up close, it's really, a lot of it's just brush. And the shed on this flowery colored blouse, it had a lot of different colors, but too many colors. So I just kind of left it very cool. And then if you look at it, the white, she flows in and out of space. So you don't have this cutout thing. You have this the blouse kind of really pushes you in and out of space a lot.
Oh, it's that's I noticed that immediately on the right. You enter into the blouse because the edge is lost. You've just got the shadows coming off of it. So then we, the viewer, are inside that blouse, and then it has the hard edge over on the left.
Right.
It's so nicely done. The other thing that kills me is the way that you did the dominant elbow, which is it looks just like a kind of you're letting the paint be really loose there.
Yeah, it's just
it in at the last. It still does its job, but you're letting it be a little wild.
I think that's the hand. What I call the hand of the artist. I like something that's feels painterly, however you want to call it, or organic. But you still feel the structure of the thing. You can still feel the structure there and the weight of it. And that adds to the way she's got her arms folded. That adds to a weightness to the gestural quality of the thing.
Yeah.
And that kind of pulls you in emotionally because of the way she's gestured and the way she's looking. There's a seriousness to it, and there's a kind of a weight to it. There's an emotional quality to the thing.
Yeah, I think that to me is one of the really interesting things about the moment of time that we're in right now, where fine art is the academy, the tastemakers.
Oh yeah,
fine art.
Tastemaker, I love that.
The playing of an emotion card as either you have to do it ironically or it's lessening to have something that has a genuine, where you're using human emotion to tell part of the story. And to me, that's crazy, because we can use all these tools. We're talking about dark and light. We're talking about drawing. We're talking about composition. And then you're also talking about what does it mean when there is a woman with her arms folded? All these things go into making the totality of the image. And
I think that's the beauty of art, is to try to capture the human condition, of the humanity of us. And I think we've entered an era of technology where it's kind of eroded some of that. But I think it's up to the artist. The artist always regrounds us, no matter what period of time we live in. It is always the artist that regrounds us and reminds us what we are and the fragileness of what we are. And so I think that's a quality that we're going to need, Charlie. And I think sometimes if you live long enough, and as you age and you begin to reflect on life, you you want that quality of that existence, and you want to reflect on that. And as a painter, I can say this wholeheartedly. Sometimes it's been tough for me as a painter. Sometimes, not all, with galleries where they want you to do something because they can sell it. And is it important to sell? Yes, it is important to sell because I have a family I got to take care of. But what's more important is that I leave a rich human quality after my earthly existence, and hopefully that will turn into something more endearing to people as they view my work once I'm gone.
Mhm.
So.
I think you're absolutely right. Now, Richie Vios, you know Richie, young from San Antonio. He is a very, very good watercolorist who's coming up in the plein air world right now. And he asked, "What's your advice for a plein air artist want to transition to museum level works?" Richie Vios is swinging for the fences here, ladies and gentlemen.
What's my advice? Oh man, the art world, the music. I don't even know exactly what museum quality is, because that conversation is so elusive now. The art world, I think Troy and I talked about this. The art world is very political. There's a lot of layers to all this. I think the best way to get to museums, if that's what you're after, if that's what you want, is to stay true to yourself. And I think that showing your work in as many places as you can, because I have had quite a few museum shows, and curators are seeing the work sometimes online. Sometimes they actually see it at a gallery. Sometimes there's a person who's on the board of the museum who sees your work. And then sometimes as you build a reputation, you'll get an invitation to be a part of a museum show. And then that leads to something bigger. I was in shows out West where I wasn't a big seller in some of the Western shows, but guess what? A major art critic comes through, pulls my work out of the shadows. Next thing I know, I'm in the Christian Science Monitor with a double-page spread in the Christian Science Monitor. It's the highly read paper that someone saw, and I get a big museum show. Then I end up meeting Crosby Kemper, who's one of America's top 100 collectors, who's no longer alive now, but I end up with a couple of my paintings in the Kemper Museum. So what happens is, by staying true to yourself, and even though sometimes you have to sacrifice the sellability of your work. I've done paintings that were very tough. People who were dying of cancer. I did one painting called Courage in the City, where the gentleman had both of his legs amputated. Artists tell me, "You're never going to sell that." Well, no, but the right person sees it. And because of the serious nature of it and the commentary of it, they recognize you. They put you in a different category. And that's how you get shows. You challenge your audience. You have to figure out a way to separate yourself through challenging what's going on in the modern times. I have two paintings that's going in Prix de West this year. One is actually an urban, a factory sitting in the desert, and there's this exhaust coming out of these three large pipes, and it's basically a commentary about global warming and oil, and how oil changed the trajectory of the economy for jobs, and how this still plays a large role in the landscape that we see now. And then there's another one in there of some water towers with mountains behind it, which water is becoming a crucial issue in the West. So what happens when a critic or a curator comes through, they recognize that you are now having a different conversation in modern times, because the artists who wind up on museums are having conversations about what's going on in the modern times. And so that's what they're looking for. They're not just looking for something well done in the technical aspect. They have plenty of that in the museums. So what you have to do is you have to find something that you can sink your teeth into and see your own humanity in it, and also create conversations that are needed. Most artists who are remembered are artists who are having serious conversations about their particular moment in time. You can go from the Degas to Winslow Homer to these artists are having serious dialogue in the time period in which they live. Are we mesmerized by their skill set? Yes. But do we want to continue just to to look at them, or do we want to enter into a modern conversation about what we're doing within our modern times? And this is what separates you from Winslow Homer. You could have the same traditional flavor of the work, but the commentary of the modern era in which you live, that's what they're looking for, I believe.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely. I mean, it means being truthful, not doing shtick, and it means thinking complexly about this complex world.
Absolutely. And will a lot of collectors not want it? Absolutely. There are a lot of people who do not want that because they want something pleasant on their wall. So, but there are collectors out there who are serious and they want that commentary. There are some other things I've done of the Native American reservation. 2 of those paintings are in the Phoenix Art Museum. Do collectors want them? Not a lot. I sell them here or there. But the commentary, I wind up in the Christian Science Monitor about my reservation scenes because it speaks of the marginalization of a people that we've now romanticized in the Western canon. So, and there are a lot of artists who romanticize that Western canon. And I have nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, for me as my own personal painter, when I go and I see that, I see not just the marginalization of people. What I see is what actually took place before those reservations were there all together. So there is a link to that conversation in the modern conversation in terms of what happened throughout history. It's like I've done things of some of the, I have one in the Preta West of the mining relics. Now, if you look at mining and oil, that's still a conversation. Even though those relics are still around, that particular structure can be easily fed into the modern conversation with what's going on with oil and global warming. And so there's a whole different kind of conversation, even though some people may like it for its nostalgia. But I have done it as a painter for modern day conversations. And when people interview me about my work, I can have those conversations so that people understand there's a lot more to this than just Mitchell painting nostalgia. He's having a conversation about the modern landscape.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to close it. That is you just stated something so brilliantly. So, Dean, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Charlie. Like I said, I'm a fan of yours, bro. So I was happy to be on your program, man. Thanks for inviting me.
Back at you. Everybody else, we'll see you soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Charlie.